All right. Last week we had troubles with the internet connection, so I'm re-recording the class. We're going to delete it from YouTube, the class last week, and we'll put this up. And I will keep this file, and if you want to download it, you can download it from Skype. But I'll keep it in my files. And last week's class will be this lesson A, and this week will be that same lesson number B. Okay, all right. We have non sequitur fallacies. This is a new kind of fallacy, and non sequitur, that's Latin. And the reason they have so much Latin in here is because logic began to be taught back in the Middle Ages, and even during our colonial times in America, when we had our Revolutionary War, the language of commerce in Europe at that time was Latin. So everybody, when they got together, would speak Latin whenever they would, diplomats were talking to one another. And so Latin was the language of commerce, and Latin was the language of the people who are diplomatic language. So non sequitur is Latin. It means it does not follow. This is Fowler and Aaron, of course. And let's look at some formal fallacies in deduction. We have here undistributed middle term. Now, to be distributed, and right here, I put my mouse on it, modified by either the word all or the word none. So undistributed middle term, the middle term must be distributed in at least one of the premises. Okay. It could be distributed in both, but it has to be distributed in at least one of them. Now, here's an instance where the middle term is not distributed. Now, what's the middle term? It's that term that is in both the major and minor premise, but not in the conclusion. So that would be Calvinist and Calvinist. There's your middle term. But it's not distributed. We'll see this in just a moment. We'll go back. Now, I put this in, and I'll send you the updated book. So I have some of this in there. This is page numbers 47 and 48. It goes back and shows you of our four types of proposition, A, I, E, and O type propositions. We see how we can see what's distributed. So I'm going to go back to page 47, and we'll go back to it. And this is on page 47 now. The letter D means distributed. The letter U is undistributed. That's pretty clear. We have universals, two universal propositions, A and E proposition. In an A-type proposition, the subject is distributed, but the predicate is not. And so we say all SD are in U. And I put S and N. And so that's what I've been doing here, S and N, sufficient and necessary. The sufficient condition is distributed and the necessary condition is not on A-type proposition. The E-type proposition, both subject and predicate are distributed. No SD or ND. So both of them are distributed. We have the I-type proposition down here, and neither the subject nor the predicate are distributed. Both are undistributed. And an O-type proposition, the subject is undistributed, but the predicate is not. The predicate is distributed. All right? Now, let's go down here and look just a minute. We also have types of four different figures of these, depending on where the middle term is found. Figure 1, the middle term is here, and it's here. That's figure 1. Figure 2, they're both here and here. Figure 3, they're both here and here. And figure 4, they're here and here. And so these are how they are put into it. And notice the conclusions are all S and P. They're the same. Okay. Now, right here is unconditionally valid forms. AAA, AAA is figure 1 is valid, but it's not valid in any other form. Okay. So we can get what's valid, what's not valid from this. Now I'm going to go back to page 174. Any questions before I go? All right. So we have an undistributed middle term. Now let me lay this out. Calvinist is your middle term. All right. There's Calvinist. That's the middle term. That's your middle term. It's in both the subject and the major premise and the minor premise, not in the conclusion. So it's not distributed. The A-type, both this is A and this is A. The predicate is not distributed in an A-type proposition. So the middle term is not distributed here. Any questions? That's why it's not valid. It's a non sequitur. It does not follow because we haven't distributed those two terms. The middle term is not distributed. All right. And it's only valid, AAA, AAA type proposition is only valid in figure 1 configuration, page 48. All right. And any questions? All right. Now we have an illicit process similar to undistributed middle term. Now, when you get someone's argument, you look at their argument, they may fail to have a distributed middle term. It's not valid. It won't prove anything. It doesn't prove the conclusion they're purporting to prove. The conclusion might be true for other reasons, but it's not true for this because of this argument. All Presbyterians are Calvinists, that's true. All Primitive Baptists are Calvinists, that's true. We can't say all Primitive Baptists are Presbyterians, that's not true. We can't say that. Any question? So that is not valid because the word Calvinist, the middle term is not distributed, okay? Now let's go to an illicit process. And this is a process where the major or minor term is distributed in the conclusion, but it's not distributed in the respective minor or major premise. We'll come down here and see one right here. And so right here, your minor term is gospel preachers. All right, your middle term is gospel preachers. Your minor term is those who understand the scriptures. So I'll make it red so you can highlight and see it. All right. And now we have here those who understand the scriptures. And that right there. There we have it. And right here, this is an A-type proposition, so the predicate is not distributed. It's undistributed. But yet down here in the conclusion, this same term is distributed by the word all. So that is an illicit process, in this case, of the minor term. Are there questions? So it's not proving anything, okay? All right. Oh, what happened here? Good. All right. There we go. And then we have an AAA type proposition, figure 3 configuration, which is invalid. This is, I believe, an AAA figure 2 type proposition, okay? But anyhow, it's not valid. Let's try this one. Let's look at it. We have an illicit process of the major term. Now, the major term is the conclusion of that's the predicate of the conclusion. All right, so we'll make it red. So we can kind of get it lined out. And right up here. All right. Now, this red is in the major premise, and it's also in the conclusion. It's in the right place It's in the major premise and the conclusion. But right here, this is an E-type proposition. The conclusion is, and so both the subject and predicate are distributed. We go back to page 48, I believe it was, and see that. So they're both distributed there. So this last one here is distributed, but the first one is not. So that's an illicit process of the major term. Other questions? Okay. All right. Now, we'll go back here. And we have the fallacy of denying the antecedent. And I went ahead and put the page numbers where this is introduced, and so you get more information about it. You go back to those pages. And that's something I've added in as I'm working this. Also, affirming the consequent of pages 78 through 83. You get more information up there. We won't go back and look at those, okay? Any questions? All right. Now we can have a negative conclusion from an affirmative premise, right? Look at your major premise. It's an A-type proposition. All Presbyterians are Calvinists. And then we have some Presbyterian preachers are Presbyterians. Well, that would be true. Most Presbyterian preachers would be Presbyterian, maybe all of them, but some would certainly be true. So these are an A-type and an I-type proposition. Okay. Now, what we come down to here is we have some Presbyterian preachers are not Calvinists. All right. And so our question is here, we have two affirmative premises and a conclusion that's negative. And this is an AIO figure 1 form. And if we go to our square of opposition chart, we see that the A and the O propositions, the A and the O type propositions they're contradictory. So an AIO proposition in any form, form 1, figure 1 form, figure 2 form, figure 3 form, figure 4 form, is automatically contradictory. So it can never be true. Other questions? All right. So that's why that won't work. Now, the AIO form is not valid in any of the 4 figures, and I just showed you the A and the O proposition contradict one another. So it's always self-contradictory no matter which of the 4 figures it's in. Now we have 2 negative premises, also called the fallacy of exclusive premises. That's another term for it. And so that one's harder to show. We could probably show it with Venn diagrams, but we haven't got to Venn diagrams yet. We could show it that way, but it's a little harder to show it. Let me do something that I think is kind of intuitive. Let's say I write a name of something on a sheet of paper. Tell you 2 things, give you 2 premises about what I've written. First, I tell you that the word that I have written is not an animal. That's negative, see? Second, I tell you that the word that I've written down is not something that's red in color. It's also negative. You will not be able to give a certain answer for what I wrote on a sheet of paper, other than that the information won't lead you to a proper conclusion. Why? Because there are many things that could be non-red, non-animals. Okay? So we see here that a double negative, 2 negative premises won't give you a conclusion. Okay? That's certain. You can't be certain of the conclusion. Okay? Any questions? All right. We have another fallacy of ambiguity. Something is ambiguous, and what let's define ambiguous. Troika defines it for us, and we'll give other definitions. It's important. I've had people say, "Are you saying there's the words in the Bible that are ambiguous?" Yes, I'm saying that. Definitely saying that. We can see words that are ambiguous. Ambiguity. Some Greek words may be ambiguous, like the word that's translated blaspheme is also in the New Testament, in the English translation, it's translated blaspheme. The same word is translated rail. We have to go to the context to see if it's talking about speech directed at God, it's blasphemy. If it's talking about speech directed at a man, it's railing. So, but both of those are the same word. We can get a number of other words. The word lust, translated lust in English, the word lust is bad, it's evil. Whereas the same Greek word, epithumao, is translated for strong desire. And it's applied to Jesus, which we know he didn't sin. So sometimes that English word, we have to translate that one Greek word with two different English words, depending on the context. And so that sometimes can be problematic. So let's look at it. Ambiguity and equivocation describe expressions that are not clear because there's more than one meaning. In this case, the Greek word has a single meaning, but it can, in English, it gets two meanings. That's blasphemao, lust, and epithumao, the strong desire or lust. So sometimes a word is very clear in English, whereas in Greek, it's not clear. So it may be ambiguous in Greek. It may have more than one meaning in Greek. And what we get into is we have love is the English word, but there's three different Greek words in the New Testament that are translated love, and the Greeks had a fourth word that we don't have in the New Testament that's translated love. So again, we can go from one language to another. We can have equivocation or ambiguity. It could be ambiguous. It could have more than one meaning. So that's important that we look at our context and see what the meaning is. An ambiguous expression may be taken either way by the reader. Statements such as "they were entertaining guests" is ambiguous. Why? Because the guest or the guest amusing to be with, or were people giving hospitality to guests? Were they entertaining the guest, or were the guest entertaining them? An equivocal expression, by contrast, used in two or more ways in a single sentence. They're close to the same thing, but equivocating, you change the meaning of the word in the sentence. So you have two different meanings for a word in a sentence. Ambiguous means you have one meaning for the word, but then you got to figure out what it is from the context. Freely, 8th class in college, he says ambiguity arises when the meaning of the word, phrase, or passage may be reasonably interpreted. Now, it's reasonably interpreted in two or more ways. For example, what does the speaker mean when saying, "I favor the American way of doing things"? Well, what does it mean? There's a lot of things he could mean, right? So politicians will say something like that, and then people will then hear it and they'll put their own meaning on it. Okay. Any questions or comments? Equivocation, however, Hurley, and this is the logic book now, and I think Hurley's book is one of the best of these three, but I think all three books are very useful that I use, and Barker and Hurley and Copey. The fallacy of equivocation occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that one or more words are used either explicitly or implicitly in two different senses in the argument. That's equivocation. Now, see of four terms, but it's actually equivocation in the argument. All designing persons are untrustworthy. All engineers are those who design, and all engineers are those who are untrustworthy. Well, let's look at this. Designing persons right here is in the well, it won't. Okay. Those are your two middle terms. But designing persons and those who design don't mean the same thing. That's where you have four terms. You have the two red ones are two terms. Untrustworthy is another term, and engineers is the fourth term. You have four terms because the two red ones don't mean the same thing. So they mean something different. So you have four terms. That's the fallacy of four terms. And it poses syllogism, but it's not. And it's a form of equivocation. Okay? Any questions? And you got to be careful. People will do that and use that and use things in that way. In this argument, the words designing does not have different meanings. Here's another one. The assertion all colors are either black or white is a fallacy because they're grays. Well, this is a claim that some make, and then they'll say, therefore, matters of morality are neither black nor white, they're gray areas of morality. Well, you can't take the colors and draw a parallel to morality. The words black and white and morality are different in meaning than the words black and white when you're talking colors. It's just a figure of speech. And again, that's a form of equivocation. Okay. Here's another one that's real interesting. I think it's kind of humorous. Preacher, I'm just a poor preacher, meaning one that doesn't have very many possessions. And respondent, I know you're a poor preacher. I talked to some of the members where you preach. They've been listening to you. So he's referring to the poorly preached sermon. So here, poor preacher and poor preacher are used in two different ways. So we've equivocated. We changed the meaning of this word right in the middle of the stream, like changing horses in the middle of the stream. Any question? And people do that. You got to be careful because they'll slip it by you if you're not careful. All right, now we have another fallacy, the fallacy of composition. All right, it's committed when a person argues that what's true of the individual is true of the whole. Let's go through this because you see this too. I see people making this mistake. And of course, when we get down to the end of this section, I'll give you pages in my other books where these fallacies are noted and pointed out in some of the reasoning of people. But the fallacy of composition, one of this is in bold print. It's in bold print in the original. I don't change the print unless if I do, I say, I make a note of it, okay? The fallacy of composition is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transference of an attribute of the parts of something onto the whole. In other words, the fallacy occurs when it is argued that because the parts have a certain attribute, it follows that the whole has that attribute too. The situation is such that the attribute in question cannot legitimately be transferred from parts to the whole. Now, sometimes they can be transferred, but not always. Most of the time they cannot. I'm having trouble here now. I have class tomorrow night. Each atom in this piece of chalk is invisible. I'm holding up a pencil right now. You can't see it. But each atom in this pencil is invisible. It is. That means I could then argue that the pencil is invisible. See, you know that's not true. So because the atoms in the chalk are invisible, doesn't mean the chalk is invisible. Here's another one. Sodium and chlorine, the two elements that make up salt. By salt, I mean what we call table salt. The word salt is used by chemists in a broader sense than what we're using it here. I'm talking about the common table salt that we put on our food. So it's sodium chloride is what it's called. And so sodium and chlorine are both deadly poisons, and that's true. And then we argue then that means that the salt is deadly poison. That's not true. So these two elements that it's made up of are deadly poison, but the salt itself is not. So again, Hurley uses another example of it. right? So right here we have the fallacy of composition here. And then Barker gives us another illustration. He said, next we shall consider the fallacy of composition and division. These two special forms of equivocation. See, this is equivocation. You've changed the meaning of this word in the middle of the string. So when you talk about the parts being poisonous, like sodium chloride, then you can't project that to the whole. The whole is not necessarily poisonous. We shall consider the fallacy of composition and division, two special forms of equivocation that involve an improper sort of reasoning from part to whole or from whole to part. And they may be occurring syllogisms or other kinds of arguments. So we have in syllogism, we also have in indirect arguments. Gives us an illustration of it. It's called the fallacy of equivocation. If some definite word or phrase is ambiguous, then he says, in under this same heading, fallacy of composition and division are two special forms of equivocation. So this is the same category. It's equivocation, special case. So an improper sort of reasoning from part to whole and whole to part. Copey, he says the term fallacy of composition is applied to both of two closely related types of invalid argument. The first may be described as reasoning fallaciously from the attributes of the parts of a whole to the attributes of the whole itself. The other type of composition fallacy is strictly parallel to that described. Here, the fallacious reasoning is of the attributes of the individual elements or members of the collection to attributes of the collection as a whole. All right, so we're going to give some illustrations of it. The second kind of composition may be defined as invalid inference that may truly be predicated on the term distributively, may also be truly predicated on the term collectively. So what's true of the individual parts is true of the whole. That's what he's saying there. And they, although parallel, are really distinct because the difference between the mere collection of elements and the whole constructed out of those elements. But they still have the same fallacy. Now here's one. The individual Christian can spend his money to support a Christian college. I believe we can do that. I believe we can pay for the teaching of English and history and government, mathematics and stuff like that in a Christian college with our own money. I don't believe there's anything wrong with that. Therefore, the church can spend the money, the treasury of the church, for the support of a Christian college. This has been an issue with the churches, the Lord's Church. The churches west of the Mississippi River, by and large, followed the firm foundation earlier, back in the 19th century, and they opposed supporting the colleges out of the treasury. Oklahoma Christian College, when I went there, it was part of their charter that they couldn't accept money from the treasury churches. That's part of their charter. But the churches east of Mississippi were taking money out of the treasury. So this is an issue, and I believe that what we have here, just because an individual can support the Christian God doesn't mean that the church can, the collective can. It's the same fallacy. The individual can spend his money for entertainment also. And therefore, the church can spend the money from the treasury for entertainment. I'm convinced that the money, when it goes into the collection plate, becomes holy. And there's only three things we can spend that money for, and that would be evangelism, that's teaching the lost; edification, that's edifying the saved, those that are Christians, teaching them how to, and helping them to grow; and then third, benevolence. I believe these are the three roles that the church can do. We can't spend the Lord's money to build gymnasiums and other stuff like that, because that's not the work of the church. And if the money is holy when it goes into the treasury, and if we go back to the Old Testament, it became holy, then we can't spend it for whatever we want. We have to spend it for what God has decreed. He's only given us authority to spend it for those three things. But that's a broad category: evangelism, edification, and benevolence. Right? But I don't believe we can spend it for entertainment. And I deal with this illustrations right here. Here's another one, the fallacy of division. It's the other way. When a person argues that what's true collectively or the whole of a class must be true of each part. It's a reverse fallacy of composition. Composition goes from parts to the whole, division goes from whole to parts. That's what we're seeing here. All right. Here's an example of it. Salt is a non-poisonous compound. That's true. Therefore, its component parts are elements, sodium and chlorine, are non-poisonous. Well, no, that's not true. They're both deadly poisons. So this jigsaw puzzle, when assembled, is circular in shape. We could have one that's circular. And therefore, each piece is circular in shape. Well, you can't have a jigsaw puzzle that's circular and have the pieces all to be circular. You could have one or two of the pieces, or some of them, but not all of them. You got to put a bunch of circles together and get one other circle that's bigger. Some of those will have to be irregular shapes, not circular. Another one is the Royal Society is over 300 years old. Therefore, Professor Thompson is a member of the Royal Society. Therefore, he's over 300 years old. Ludicrous this can become. So this we can see this fallacy, and we have to be careful that we don't commit it. Each case, the attribute designated respectively by the terms non-poisonous, circular in shape, over 300 years old, is illegitimate and transfers from the whole or whole class onto the parts and members. As with the position, it's not always legitimate. Okay, we could have a jigsaw puzzle that was square, and all the parts of the jigsaw puzzle could be square. That could be. So it's not always a fallacy, but the vast majority of the time it is a fallacy. Right? So we got to be careful with it, not make it always a fallacy. The congregation of the church, here's an example, is strong. So that congregation is strong. Therefore, each member of the congregation must be strong. That's not necessarily true. We may have a few members that have just been obeyed the gospel. They're weak and they have to be taught. Ideally, a church that's growing is going to have members that are weak. We just got new converts. We got to teach them. So an ideal congregation is going to be growing and converting people, teaching people, and we're going to have weak members. And so the strong need to be teaching the weak. That's what we're all about, encouraging them by example and by teaching as well. Another claim is, in Ephesians 2:19-22, the church is a temple. And yet, then the argument's made, therefore, each member of the church is a temple. Well, that won't fly either. It's got the same problem. And so I would say that we got a fallacy here in that regard. So if the whole church is a temple, that doesn't mean that every individual member is a temple. Might be, but we couldn't prove it from this verse. Let me read this verse and you'll see what I'm saying. Verse 19. So then ye are no more strangers and sojourners, but you're fellow citizens with the saints and with the household of God, being built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom each several building fitly framed together groweth into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are built together for a habitation of God in the Spirit. So that's an assumption here that the whole church is a temple, and so that makes each individual a temple. Again, that's a fallacy. That's the same fallacy. All right. Now, this right here is the first fallacy. And our first fallacy was we got the fallacy of division here. All right. And so the last one is the fallacy of division. Okay. Here's the fallacy of division passages. All right. So we have the two fallacies set out in two different paragraphs here. So Fox 2003 is my volume 1 of the Holy Spirit. Fox 2006, 2005 would be my volume 2. Don't have any references there in it. Fox 2006 volume 1 is the Role of Women, volume 1. And volume 2 is these pages. When I combine those two books, the Guthrie Role of Women combined edition, have these pages. Fox 2007 is a Great Commission book. Box 2000 is my flood book. Okay. Any questions? All right. The fallacy of amphiboly. This is an interesting fallacy. It's an ambiguity attaches not to a word, but to the entire sentence. Here's a real good example of it. And right here we have this. I won't read it all. You can read it yourself. It's almost amusing. All you do is change the punctuation and you'll change the meaning of the sentence. That's what he does. He has a good man. He says he's an old and experienced man, and vice wickedness is never found. Here he's an old and experienced man, and vice wickedness, and then he is never found opposing the work of iniquity. So right here, by changing the punctuation where the commas and periods are, you change the meaning of the sentence. And there's some translations that have done that, and I'll have an example of some here in just a minute. And they're not honest. And here's another one. Can you spell backwards? Well, what do you mean by that? Can you spell the word backwards, or can you spell backwards, the word backwards, or can you spell things backwards? See? So it has a double meaning, and you're not clear as to what it is. So it's ambiguous, not clear. Right here, Oneness Pentecostals, I've debated a couple of them. Oneness Pentecostals quoted Matthew 3:17 in such a way to support their doctrine. Now, understand, they teach that the Son is the same person as the Father, and the same person as the Holy Spirit. They're all the same person. But here's how they quote Matthew 3:17. And lo, a voice out of heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased." Now, that's why it reads. And so what they will quote it as, they'll say, they change the punctuation so it reads saying, "This is my beloved Son, whom I am, well pleased." And frequently they'll leave out the word well pleased. In debate, I had them to say this is my beloved Son, whom I am. They'd stop right there. Of course, it sounds good. It sounds like the Father is in the Son. He's inside his body. See? And that's one of their doctrines, of course. So they actually misquote the passage or leave out well pleased and put the comma in the wrong spot. Okay? This is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased. And they'll say, "This is my beloved Son, whom I am, well pleased." So this, of course, I don't believe is an honest approach to the scriptures. Right? But I had to point this out to them in my debate with this Oneness Pentecostal on the number of persons in the Godhead. He says there's only one person. Father, Son, and the Spirit are the same person. Right? We have a fourth example of this fallacy. Jehovah's Witnesses have changed the punctuation of Luke 23:43. Right? They don't have you going to paradise at death. So they don't have that. So you got to be aware of what they teach. So their New World Translation, if you get a copy of it, if you go to a used bookstore and find one, you probably ought to buy one. So you know what they teach, and you have documentation. The New World Translation of 23:43 says, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." Doesn't say I'll be with you in paradise. That's not how the text reads. Okay, so again, they changed the wording of that passage. Right? Any questions? In Fox 2003, Volume 1, page 42, I have one example of this fallacy in that book. That's the Holy Spirit, Volume 1. All right. Any further questions? All right. Now, the fallacy of accent. Can change the accent on the word and change what it means. Here's one, 1 Kings 13:27. Could be easily twisted. And he spake to his son, saying, "Saddle me the ass," and they saddled him. What did they do? Did they saddle the man or did they saddle the ass? But obviously they saddled the ass, they didn't saddle the man. But it's ambiguous. It could be saying that the son saddled their father. Okay. Right? And of course, that would be absurd, but that's certainly, it could be interpreted that way. if you're not careful. It's an amusing example of it, but it just shows what could be done. Here's another one that I've run into with regard to members of the church. He took a cup and gave thanks and gave them, saying, "Drink ye all of it." Now, what does the word all mean? To whom does the word all refer to? Does it refer to all of the contents of the cup? Or does it refer to all of the apostles or the drink of it? Well, in the Greek, the word all refers to the apostles. All of you drink of it. I think there's some of the modern translations that translate it to all of you drink of it. I run into members of the church. We had a woman. She was very knowledgeable of the scriptures, very knowledgeable, and a good woman. She's dead now at Barnes, but she told me that you had to drink all of the juice in the cup, and of course that was her thinking on this, drinking all of what's in the cup. And I told her, I said, no, that's referring to that word. All refers to the apostles. And of course, I was just a young preacher, and she didn't believe me. She respected Brother Hugo McCord, and so I told her, why don't you ask him? I don't know if she ever asked him about it, but I tried to get her to go to him. I'm not ashamed to tell him, send him to someone else. I'm confident we'll tell them the truth, okay? And I know people don't necessarily want to believe everything I say, and that's certainly, they should check it out. All right. And so this woman she wasn't sinning and holding this view, but she just thought we ought to drink everything, turn the cup up and drink everything in it, every bit of the juice in the container. Any questions? Here's another one. So when they had broken their fast, Jesus saith to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, lovest thou me more than these? And he said unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He said unto him, Feed my lambs. The word these might refer to the fish or to the other apostles. And that's a good question. Was he saying, do you love me more than you love your fish? Or is he saying, do you love me more than the other apostles love me? I don't know which one is true. I can make a good case for either one of them. But it looks to me like he's gone back to his fishing business. I think he's loved me more than you do your fish. And then feed my lambs. But again, I'm not dogmatic on that one. But that one right there is ambiguous. Right? We're getting pretty close to the end of our material. We've gone about 10, 30, gone about 45 minutes. And let me do this. All right. The ad hominem fallacies of irrelevance. It's irrelevant what the matter is. It's not important. It's not relevant. So we'll look at this in our next class, which will be in January of 2024. Any questions?